3 days after I closed the doors of my watch shop for the last time, my neighbor called. His voice was shaking. "I left the garage camera connected to my tablet by accident," he said. "Frank, your daughter and her husband have been inside your house. They were opening your display cases." He paused. "Come over now. And whatever you do, don't tell Celeste." When I saw the footage, 40 years of patience shattered in 11 seconds. And the mechanism I built over the next 10 days would be the most precise piece of work I have ever assembled. Welcome, everyone. And thank you for being here. If you enjoy stories like this, please like the video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. A quick reminder before we begin. This story includes fictionalized elements designed to enhance the storytelling experience. Any similarities to real individuals or situations are purely accidental, but the message about trust, betrayal, and the lengths we go to protect the people we love carries very real meaning. Now, let's continue. The thin metallic ping of a loosened balance wheel echoed through my workshop, a sound so delicate it could have been the last note of a music box winding down. I was hunched over my bench, a jeweler's loop pressed against my right eye, easing a pair of brass tweezers into the movement of a walnut-cased wall clock. Constance had picked it out at an estate sale in Thunderbolt the spring after we were married. She said a house without a ticking clock was just a building pretending to be alive. My name is Franklin Beaumont. Most people around Tybee Island just call me Frank. I am 66 years old, a third-generation watchmaker who spent 4 decades behind the counter of Beaumont & Sons timepieces on Broughton Street in Savannah. 3 days earlier, I had turned the brass deadbolt on that shop door for the final time, slid the key into my vest pocket, and walked away from the only profession I had ever known. Retirement was supposed to feel like setting down a heavy tool at the end of a long shift. Instead, it felt like someone had removed the mainspring from my chest and forgotten to wind a replacement. The workshop behind my house had become the place where I tried to remember who I was without the shop. It was a single room built onto the back of our Victorian on Tybee Island, the house my grandfather had purchased in 1952 with earnings from his first decade repairing maritime chronometers for the Savannah Port Authority. The walls smelled of clock oil and magnolia wood. Rows of antique timepieces lined the shelves. A Patek Philippe from 1942 that my grandfather accepted as payment during the war, an Omega Seamaster that had belonged to my father. And tucked in the back of the glass display case sat the crown jewel, a Breguet pocket watch from 1890. Its silver case engraved with a floral pattern so fine it looked like frozen lace. Constance used to say that watch had more character than most of the people in Chatham County. Constance. Even now, 18 months after the stroke took her, I still caught myself listening for her footsteps in the hallway. She had a way of walking that made the old floorboards sing a specific melody, a rhythm I could identify the way a watchmaker identifies a movement by its tick. The silence she left behind was not the peaceful kind. It was the silence of a mechanism that had stopped, leaving all the other gears waiting for a pulse that would never come. Have you ever held something so familiar your hands could work it in total darkness, yet suddenly felt as though you were touching it for the very first time? That is what retirement had done to my world. Every object in this workshop carried a memory so dense it had weight. And without the daily rhythm of the shop to keep me moving forward, the accumulated gravity of all those years pressed down on my shoulders at once. The vibration came without warning. A low, insistent buzz against the workbench, sharp enough to rattle the tiny screws in their porcelain dish. I set down the tweezers and removed the loop. The screen showed a number I recognized, but rarely saw. Beauregard. Thibodeau. Most people on the island called him Beau. 71 years old. A retired Cajun chef from Lafayette, Louisiana. He lived 3 houses down the sandy lane in a shotgun cottage that always smelled of cayenne and pipe tobacco. Beau and I shared the quiet camaraderie of men who had outlived their partners and found that the only honest company left was the kind that did not require conversation. I answered. The first thing I noticed was his breathing. Shallow and uneven. the rhythm of a man who had been pacing a small room for too long. Frank. His voice was hoarse, stripped of its slow Cajun warmth. Are you alone? I glanced around the empty workshop. Sawdust motes drifted through the late afternoon light. I am always alone, Bo. What is going on? There was a pause. The kind of silence that carries weight, like the moment before a grandfather clock releases its chime. You remember last spring? When you asked me to watch the house while you went to that horological conference in Atlanta? He began. I helped you set up the camera system in the garage and the workshop so you could check in remotely. I remembered. Bo had been the one to suggest the cloud-based system. He was surprisingly capable with technology for a man who still wrote grocery lists on the back of recipe cards. I made a mistake, Frank. His voice dropped. I never disconnected my tablet from the cloud account. The motion alert went off 3 days ago while I was reading on the porch, and I looked. My hand tightened around the phone. The ticking of the clocks on the shelves, which I usually found comforting, now sounded like a countdown I had not been warned about. What did you see, Bo? His voice cracked. Frank, your daughter and her husband have been inside your house. Multiple times. They were in your workshop. They were opening your display cases and going through your personal papers. The words landed like a dropped pocket watch. The kind of impact that looks small from the outside but shatters everything beneath the case. Celeste. My 33-year-old daughter. The last living thread connecting me to Constance. And Mitchell Ward, her husband of 7 years. A real estate attorney with a handshake that always lasted 1 second too long. Come over now, Frank. Bo said quickly. I saved the footage. You need to see it yourself. Then his tone hardened into something I had never heard from him. And whatever you do not call Celeste. Do not text her. Not until you have watched every second. The line went dead. I stood in the workshop, the loop still warm in my palm, the Breguet gleaming faintly behind the display glass. For the first time in 40 years of steady, patient work, my hands were trembling. I did not lock the workshop door. I did not put away the tweezers or return the loop to its felt-lined case. For 40 years, the discipline of a watchmaker had governed every movement of my hands. Every tool placed precisely in its designated slot before the lights went off. But the urgency in Bo's voice had cracked that discipline like a hairline fracture through a watch crystal. Invisible at first, but impossible to ignore once you know it is there. The engine of my pickup turned over with a rough cough that startled a pair of mockingbirds from the live oak beside the driveway. I pulled out onto the narrow sandy lane that connected the houses along this stretch of Tybee Island. The late October air carried the brackish scent of the marsh and the faint sweetness of Confederate jasmine that had no business still blooming this late in the season. Under normal circumstances, I would have noticed the way the afternoon sun gilded the Spanish moss hanging from the oaks. Today, the beauty was invisible. My mind had already left the island and was circling the same 3 questions over and over. What were they looking for? How many times had they been inside? And why had Mitchell been opening the display cases? Bo's cottage sat at the end of a crushed oyster shell driveway, a narrow shotgun house with a tin roof that pinged in the rain like a snare drum. Before I could reach the front steps, the screen door swung open. Bo stood in the frame, one hand gripping the door jamb. The man I knew as a slow-moving, easy-laughing Cajun who could spend an entire afternoon debating the proper ratio of roux to stock now looked as though he had aged a decade in a single week. His face was drawn tight, the skin beneath his eyes bruised with exhaustion. He did not say a word. He simply stepped aside and tilted his head toward the hallway. The den at the back of his house smelled of stale pipe, tobacco, and chicory coffee, a combination so thick it felt like walking into a memory. The curtains were drawn, leaving the room in a permanent dusk, broken only by the cold blue glow of a laptop sitting open on a cluttered desk. The light from the screen cast sharp shadows across stacks of old cookbooks and a framed photograph of Bo's late wife, Mireille, standing in front of their restaurant in Lafayette. Bo gestured toward the chair across from the desk. But I could not sit. My legs felt locked. My weight balanced on the balls of my feet, as though my body was already preparing to move in a direction my mind had not yet chosen. "Before I show you," Bo said quietly, lowering himself into his own chair with the careful movements of a man whose joints no longer forgave haste, "I need to tell you something, so you understand why I did not just delete what I saw and pretend it never happened." He stared at the floor for a long moment. 15 years ago, my brother Remy cleaned out my entire savings. Every cent I earned from the restaurant. His voice was flat, the way a man speaks about a wound that is scarred over but never fully healed. It started with a small request, help with a lease payment. Then another. By the time I sat down and actually looked at the accounts, the money had been routed through 3 different names I had never heard of. He lifted his eyes to meet mine. I did not catch it because I trusted him. Trust was the lock he picked, Frank. And by the time I realized what he had done, the door was already off its hinges. I understood then why Bo had called me instead of simply minding his own business. He recognized the mechanism. He had seen these gears turn before. Have you ever stood in a room where someone is about to show you something that will permanently divide your life into before and after? The air changes. It becomes heavier, almost liquid, as though the atmosphere itself knows what is coming and is trying to slow you down. Bo turned the laptop toward me. The screen displayed a frozen frame from a security camera feed. The timestamp in the lower right corner read 6 days ago, 3:17 in the afternoon. The image was slightly grainy but unmistakable. My living room, my bookshelves, my desk, and sitting on my sofa, leaning forward with the focused intensity of a burglar casing a vault, was my son-in-law Mitchell Ward, 39 years old, real estate attorney, broad-shouldered, wearing the navy polo shirt I had seen him in at dinner the previous Sunday. Beside him, perched on the edge of the cushion with her hands nervously twisting the hem of her sweater, was my daughter Celeste. Bo clicked play. The footage came to life with the muffled, ambient sounds of my own house. The refrigerator humming in the kitchen. The faint tick of the hallway clock. Mitchell stood and moved directly to my workshop door, which I always left unlocked from the inside. He entered with the confidence of a man who had done this before. Through the secondary camera feed, I watched him approach the glass display case and begin photographing each timepiece with his phone. He worked methodically, tilting each watch to capture the serial number engraved on the case back, dictating notes into his phone between shots. Then he lifted the Omega Seamaster from its stand. My father's watch. The watch my grandfather had given him on the morning he took over the shop in 1968. Mitchell turned it over in his fingers the way a pawnbroker appraises merchandise, casual, detached, already calculating its liquidation value. He held my family's history in his hand, the way you hold a coin you are about to spend. Something inside my chest compressed so tightly, it felt like the mainspring of a watch wound past its limit, one half turn from snapping. Mitchell set the Omega back on its stand, with the carelessness of a man returning a borrowed tool he had no intention of respecting. Then he pulled his phone to his ear and dialed. The speaker was close enough to the camera's microphone that I could hear the other end of the conversation, thin and distorted but unmistakable. He was calling an auction house. "I am looking at a collection of approximately 14 pieces," Mitchell said, his voice carrying the smooth transactional rhythm of a man who negotiated for a living. Mostly mid-century European. 1 Patek Philippe, 1 Omega, and a Breguet pocket watch that I am told dates to 1890. He paused, listening. "No. The owner is not aware of the appraisal yet. I am handling the estate on his behalf." Estate. The word hit me like a slap. I was standing 3 houses away. Alive, breathing, with a heartbeat strong enough to feel pulsing in my temples, and my son-in-law was already referring to my life's collection as an estate, as though I were a problem that had already been resolved and all that remained was the paperwork. On the screen, Celeste had moved to my desk. She was opening drawers with the tentative, guilty movements of someone who knows they should not be there, but has convinced themselves the reason is important enough to justify the intrusion. She pulled out a manila folder I recognized instantly. It contained the original deed to the house, the property records dating back to my grandfather's purchase in 1952, and the updated title I had filed after Constance passed. Mitchell ended his call and walked back into the living room. He stood behind Celeste, looking over her shoulder at the documents spread across the desk. Then he picked up a pen from the cup beside my lamp and held it above the signature line on what appeared to be a legal form I did not recognize. He did not even read page 7, Mitchell said, and the smirk in his voice was audible even through the compressed audio of the security feed. I slid it between the health directive updates and the insurance renewal. He signed the whole stack in one sitting. He mimicked a signing motion in the air, a lazy flourish that made my signature look like a joke. The old man signs whatever I put in front of him. I stopped breathing. The room around me dissolved. Beau's den, the stale tobacco, the blue light, all of it vanished. The only thing that existed was the screen and the voice of a man I had welcomed into my family 7 years ago, describing how easily he had turned my trust into a weapon. I remembered that afternoon. It was 3 weeks earlier. Mitchell and Celeste had stopped by after Sunday dinner. Mitchell had produced a thick envelope from his briefcase, explaining that my insurance carrier required updated beneficiary information and that the health directive Constance and I had drafted years ago needed to be refreshed. He had walked me through the first few pages with patience and clarity, pointing to each signature line with the tip of his pen. I had signed them all, every single page. Because he was my daughter's husband, and because I had spent my life trusting the people who sat at my table. Have you ever watched someone you love inventory your entire life as though it were nothing more than a clearance sale? The daughter I raised, the child Constance and I had built every holiday and bedtime story around, was sitting at my desk, sorting through the architecture of my existence, while her husband calculated its market value on the phone. The footage continued. Mitchell explained to Celeste that the documents Frank had signed granted them full financial power of attorney and initiated a preliminary transfer of the property title into a joint holding. Celeste's face on the screen showed discomfort. Her eyes kept darting toward the hallway, her shoulders tight, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the folder. But she did not stop. She did not stand up and walk out. She stayed seated and continued organizing the papers into a neat stack, as though tidiness could somehow make the theft respectable. Mitchell leaned back in my chair. My chair. The leather wingback Constance had given me for my 60th birthday, and crossed his ankle over his knee with the ease of a man who believed he had already won. The house alone is worth $1.8 million in this market, he said. The collection adds another $400,000 to $500,000, and his retirement accounts are sitting at $720,000. Once the transfer clears, we are looking at close to $3 million in total liquid value. He said the number the way a man reads a restaurant check, casually, without reverence, as though $3 million and 66 years of a man's labor were simply figures on a page waiting to be settled. Beau paused the video. The screen froze on Mitchell's face, that confident, unconcerned expression of a predator who has cornered something too old and too trusting to fight back. I became aware of my own breathing again. It was shallow, controlled, the breathing of a man who is holding something volatile inside his chest and knows that one wrong exhale could detonate it. Beau was watching me carefully, the way you watch a structure that might be about to collapse. There are 4 more recordings, Beau said softly. He had already begun transferring the files to my phone. The device buzzed once, then again, then again. Each vibration pulsed against my thigh like the tick of a clock I could not see, but could feel counting down to something I was not yet ready to name. I reached for the doorframe to steady myself. "Thank you, Beau," I said. My voice sounded foreign to me, as though it belonged to someone standing on the other side of a thick wall. I have seen enough for now. Outside, the evening air off the marsh wrapped around me, warm and heavy with salt. I climbed into my truck and sat with my hands on the wheel, staring through the windshield at nothing. I could not go home. The thought of walking back into that house, touching the chair Mitchell had lounged in, standing at the desk Celeste had violated, made my throat tighten. I turned the key and pulled onto the road. I was not heading home. I was heading to Clary's Cafe on Abercorn Street, a 24-hour diner where the coffee was bitter. The booths were dark, and no one asked questions of a man sitting alone with a laptop and a look on his face that could curdle milk. The phone in my pocket buzzed steadily as the remaining files finished downloading, each notification landing like a nail being driven into wood that was already splintering. The fluorescent tubes above the corner booth at Clary's Cafe hummed with a faint electrical stutter that reminded me of a quartz movement running low on battery, still keeping time but only barely. The diner sat on a stretch of Abercorn Street where the tourist charm of Savannah's historic district gave way to the honest fatigue of a working neighborhood. Vinyl booths, laminated menus, the persistent smell of bacon grease embedded so deeply into the walls it had probably become structural. I had chosen the booth farthest from the counter, my back against the wall, my laptop open on the table beside a cup of coffee. I had no intention of drinking. The screen's blue glow felt clinical against the warm amber of the overhead lights. It was nearly 9 in the evening. The diner was half empty. A young couple shared a plate of onion rings near the window. A long-haul trucker in a faded ball cap worked through a pile of pancakes as though nothing in the world existed beyond the next forkful of syrup-soaked batter. I envied him. 12 hours ago, the most pressing concern in my life had been a worn pivot in a walnut-cased wall clock. Now I was sitting in a diner booth preparing to watch my family dismantle the house my grandfather built. The second file was labeled with a date from 5 days earlier. I clicked it. The footage opened on my dining room. The long cherrywood table Constance and I had found at an antique market in Beaufort the year Celeste was born. Mitchell sat at one end with a laptop open in front of him. His posture relaxed. His sleeves rolled to his elbows. Celeste was not in the frame. Mitchell tapped the screen, and a video call connected. The face that appeared belonged to a man I had never seen before. Heavy-set, clean-shaven, wearing a pale blue dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar. His background showed a modern office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking what appeared to be a downtown skyline. "Victor," Mitchell said, leaning back with the easy confidence of a man who believed he controlled the conversation. "I have the updated comps you asked for. The lot is .63 acres, including the setback. The structure itself is a 1952 Victorian, original framing, but the footprint allows for a full teardown and a 6-unit luxury configuration." A full teardown. The words landed in my stomach like cold metal. He was not talking about renovating the house. He was talking about erasing it. The walls my grandfather had raised with borrowed money and stubborn hands. The porch where Constance sat every evening, watching the marsh birds settle into the cordgrass. The kitchen where Rosalind had taken her first steps, gripping the edge of the counter with fingers so small they could barely hold a crayon. Mitchell was describing all of it as a footprint. A shape on a surveyor's map waiting to be replaced by something more profitable. Have you ever listened to someone assign a dollar amount to the place where your happiest memories live? It is a sound that makes the air taste like copper, like biting down on a coin, minted from your own history. Victor Hargrove, the developer, nodded slowly on the screen. "What are we looking at for the total package?" he asked. His voice had the flat, transactional warmth of a man who measured the world in square footage and zoning permits. Mitchell did not hesitate. $3.2 million for the land and structure. That includes the demolition timeline and the permitting fast track I have already initiated through my contacts at the county office. He paused, and then added with a tone so casual, it bordered on obscene. "My facilitation fee is $400,000, wired to the entity I mentioned last week. $400,000. A facilitation fee. That was what Mitchell Ward called the price of betraying his wife's father and bulldozing a 70-year-old house to make room for luxury condominiums that would sell to people who would never know the name Beaumont or understand what the ground beneath their imported tile floors once meant. Hargrove leaned forward. "And the owner is on board with the sale?" Mitchell smiled. It was the kind of smile I had seen 1,000 times across my repair bench, the expression of a customer who brings in a watch they know is stolen and hopes the man behind the counter will not ask questions. "The owner is elderly and recently retired," Mitchell said smoothly. "He has signed full power of attorney to my wife, his daughter. The transaction will be executed on his behalf. Clean and simple. Clean and simple. As though 70 years of family history could be dissolved like sugar in hot water." The conversation continued for another few minutes. Hargrove outlined the development timeline, a demolition target of January, with construction breaking ground in March. Mitchell confirmed that all property documentation would be filed and transferred before the 1st of November. He circled the date on a legal pad with a red pen, the same way a surgeon circles the incision site on a patient's body before cutting. November 1st. I pulled my phone from my jacket and opened the calendar. Today was October 9th. 22 days. That was the distance between this moment and the morning my house would legally cease to belong to me. 3 weeks. And a day. The time it takes to cure a coat of varnish on a wooden case, or to properly regulate a marine chronometer. Mitchell ended the call and closed the laptop. He sat alone at my dining table for a moment, running his hand along the surface of the cherry wood, the way a buyer inspects a piece of furniture he has already decided to discard. Then, he said something to the empty room. Whether he was talking to himself or simply rehearsing a line he planned to use later, I could not tell. But the camera captured it with perfect clarity. Sentimental value means nothing when the numbers are this good. I closed the file. The screen went dark for a moment before the desktop reappeared, and I caught my own reflection in the glass. An old man in a diner booth with a cold cup of coffee and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same cherrywood Mitchell had just appraised. 22 days. In watchmaking, precision is measured in fractions of a second. In my life, precision was now measured in the number of days I had left before everything my family had built was converted into a line item on a developer's spreadsheet. I opened the next file. And this time, when Mitchell's voice filled my headphones, it carried something darker than greed. It carried the unmistakable sound of a man who was not simply stealing because he wanted more. He was stealing because he was running out of time. The third recording opened on a different angle. The garage camera. My workbench was visible in the background. The neat rows of tools hanging on their pegboard silhouettes, each chisel and screwdriver in its proper place. The sight of my own organized sanctuary being used as a backdrop for Mitchell's private phone calls felt like discovering a stranger had been sleeping in your bed while you were away. Mitchell stood near the garage door, leaning against the frame with his phone pressed tightly to his ear. His posture was different in this footage. Gone was the relaxed confidence of the man who had negotiated a $3.2 million deal over video call. His free hand was rubbing the back of his neck in quick, agitated strokes. His jaw was clenched. The collar of his shirt was dark with sweat, despite the mild October air. He was speaking to someone he addressed only as David. The conversation made it clear, within the first 30 seconds, that David was not a business partner or a friend. David was his attorney, his personal defense attorney. "The mediation offer expires on the 1st, Mitchell said, his voice low and strained. "If I do not have $500,000 in escrow by November 1st, they are going to reject the settlement and move to a full malpractice trial. 500,000. The number settled into the booth beside me like an uninvited guest. I leaned closer to the screen, my headphones pressing against my ears as I tried to catch every syllable over the ambient noise of the diner. Mitchell explained the situation in clipped, terse fragments. A former client had filed a malpractice suit against him 11 months ago. The details were murky, but the stakes were not. If the mediation failed, the State Bar Association would open a formal ethics investigation. Mitchell's law license would be suspended pending review. And if the client's attorneys could prove willful negligence, which Mitchell's own lawyer seemed to believe they could, the case would be referred for criminal prosecution. This was not greed. This was survival. Mitchell Ward was not stealing from me because he wanted a bigger house or a faster car. He was stealing because his professional life was collapsing, and the only foundation he could find to stand on was mine. Have you ever discovered that the person dismantling your life is not doing it out of strength, but out of desperation? It does not make the betrayal smaller. It makes it uglier. Like watching a drowning man pull someone else underwater just to keep his own head above the surface for one more breath. The footage continued. Mitchell ended the call with David and stood in the garage, pressing both palms against his forehead, as though trying to physically hold his thoughts together. Then the side door opened, and Celeste stepped in. She looked different from the woman I had seen in the first video. The nervous energy was still there, but it had deepened into something heavier. Her eyes were swollen. The skin beneath them was bruised with the unmistakable shadow of sleepless nights. She stood just inside the doorway, arms crossed over her chest, gripping her own elbows as though she were trying to hold herself together. "I want to stop, Mitchell," she said. Her voice was barely louder than a whisper. "This is my father. I cannot keep doing this to him." For a moment, Mitchell said nothing. He lowered his hands from his forehead and turned to face her. The transformation was immediate and chilling. The desperate man who had been pleading with his lawyer 30 seconds earlier vanished, replaced by something colder, something calculated. His posture straightened, his expression hardened, and when he spoke, his voice carried the precise, surgical cadence of a man who had spent his career learning exactly how to bend language until it broke people. "You signed those insurance papers too, Celeste," he said quietly. "The ones I filed last March. You remember those forms? The ones you did not bother to read before you put your name on them?" He paused, letting the silence do its work. "That was an $85,000 insurance claim on a loss that never happened. That is fraud, Celeste. Class C felony in the state of Georgia. 3 to 10 years. Celeste's face drained of color. Her arms tightened around herself as though the temperature in the garage had dropped below freezing. Mitchell stepped closer, not touching her, not raising his voice. He did not need to. The weapon he was holding was invisible, made entirely of knowledge and leverage and the quiet certainty that he understood the legal system better than she ever would. "You want to explain to Rosalind why Mommy is wearing orange?" he asked. The question was almost gentle, the way a man might ask a child if she understands why she is being punished. "You want to sit across from her in a visiting room and tell her that Mommy decided to do the right thing, but Mommy is going to be away for a few years? Is that the conversation you want to have?" Celeste made a sound that did not belong in words. It was a compressed, airless sob that seemed to collapse inward rather than escape. She pressed both hands against her mouth and turned away from him. Through my headphones, in the dim corner of a diner on Abercorn Street, I listened to my daughter cry. I had heard Celeste cry before, when she was 7 and fell from the magnolia tree in the backyard. When Constance's diagnosis came back and I had to tell her over the phone because she was living in Atlanta and could not drive home fast enough. But this sound was different. This was not grief or pain. This was the sound of a woman being locked inside a cage, built from her own signature, by a man she had trusted enough to marry. Mitchell watched her for a moment, then turned back to his phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be legal documents. His indifference to her tears was absolute. The detachment of a man who had already moved beyond empathy into pure arithmetic. I paused the recording. My reflection stared back at me from the dark screen. The diner sounds filtered back in. The clink of silverware. The low murmur of a television mounted above the counter. A world continuing as normal while mine quietly recalibrated itself around a new axis. Mitchell Ward was not just a thief. He was a lawyer who had weaponized the law itself against his own wife. He had turned Celeste's love for Rosalind into a leash and her ignorance into a prison. Every legal concept he understood, every statute he could cite from memory, had been repurposed from tools of justice into instruments of control. I looked down at my hands. They were steady now. The trembling that had started in the workshop hours earlier was gone, replaced by something I recognized from decades behind the bench. It was the calm that comes when a watchmaker finally identifies the source of a malfunction. The diagnosis is complete. The emotion gives way to method, Every fraud has a mainspring. I whispered to the empty booth. Find it. And the whole mechanism stops. There were still 2 files left on my phone. And I knew, with the certainty of a man who has spent his life listening to the inner workings of complicated machines, that they would be darker still. There is a part inside every mechanical watch called the escapement. It is the component that controls the release of energy, one precise tick at a time, preventing the mainspring from unwinding all at once and destroying the movement. What I watched in the next 2 recordings was a man with no escapement at all. A mechanism spinning out of control with my family's future trapped inside the gears. The 4th file was time-stamped at 12:47 in the morning. The garage camera's night vision mode painted the footage in a flat, greenish gray that made my workshop look like the interior of a submarine. Mitchell was alone. He stood beside my workbench in the dim glow of a single overhead bulb, his phone wedged between his ear and shoulder as he ran his fingers along the glass front of the display case with the slow deliberation of a man browsing a jewelry store. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to someone Mitchell addressed as Anton. The conversation made it clear within seconds that Anton Kraus was not a casual acquaintance. He was a dealer, an intermediary, who specialized in the private sale of high-value antique timepieces through international auction channels. Mitchell began reading from a list on his phone, and each name he spoke was a blade pressed against a different nerve in my body. First piece. Patek Philippe, reference 96. Yellow gold, dated 1942. Original dial. Original crown. Service records available. He paused. Estimated range, 90 to 120,000. My grandfather's watch. The watch he had accepted from a Swiss merchant sailor in exchange for 6 months of chronometer repairs during the war. The watch he had placed in my hands on the morning I took over the shop, saying, "This is not a timepiece, Franklin. This is a promise," Mitchell continued. Second. Omega Seamaster. Reference 2541. Steel case. Circa 1968. Full provenance. He glanced at the display case as he spoke, tapping the glass above each watch like a man counting inventory. Third. The centerpiece. Breguet pocket watch. Number 4712. 1890. Silver case. Guilloche dial. Floral engraving. This one alone could bring 200 to 250,000 at the right venue. The Breguet. The watch Constance had called the heart of the collection. The watch she used to hold up to her ear on quiet evenings just to hear the sound of its balance wheel oscillating. A sound, she said, was more honest than any human voice she had ever heard. Mitchell's voice dropped into a businesslike murmur. Total estimated value for the full collection is 400 to 520,000. I need everything crated and removed from the premises before October 25th. Then he added the sentence that separated this recording from all the others. Celeste thinks we are just handling the property transfer. She has no idea about the collection. I set my coffee cup down on the table so carefully it did not make a sound. The revelation landed with a weight that was different from the previous betrayals. Mitchell was not just deceiving me, he was deceiving Celeste as well. My daughter believed she was participating in a property scheme, ugly enough on its own, but she did not know that her husband was simultaneously planning to liquidate 3 generations of Beaumont history through a back-channel auction without telling her. Have you ever discovered that the person you are most angry at is also being betrayed by the same hand that is robbing you? It does not soften the anger. It complicates it. The way a crack in one gear can send stress fractures spiraling through an entire movement. I opened the 5th and final file. This one was different. The camera angle showed my living room in full daylight. The curtains were open. The hallway clock was visible on the far wall, its pendulum swinging in the steady rhythm that had measured every ordinary afternoon in that house for decades. But there was nothing ordinary about what was happening in the room. Celeste sat on the sofa, her posture rigid, her hands pressed flat against her thighs. Mitchell stood over her, not pacing this time but planted, his feet set wide, his shoulders squared. He was holding his laptop open in one hand, tilted so the screen faced her. "Read it," he said. His voice carried no emotion. It was a command delivered with the mechanical precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment. Celeste's eyes moved across the screen. Her lips parted slightly. I could see from the angle of the camera that Mitchell was showing her a legal document. He began reading aloud, citing Georgia statutes on insurance fraud, articulating each penalty with the dispassionate clarity of a professor delivering a lecture. Fines. Mandatory sentencing guidelines. Felony classification. Then he closed the laptop and crouched in front of her so that their eyes were level. "If you are convicted," he said softly, "the state initiates an automatic custody review. Given the felony charge and the absence of a stable co-parent, Rosalind would be placed in temporary foster care pending the outcome of the review process." Celeste's entire body went rigid. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her pants, her knuckles white, her breathing quick and shallow. Mitchell let the silence do its work. 10 seconds. 15. Then, he delivered the final sentence with a calm, so practiced it made my skin crawl. "Rosalind will be in foster care by Christmas if you do not finish this, Celeste." My granddaughter's name in his mouth sounded like a coin being dropped into a collection box. Currency. Leverage. A 5-year-old child who loved camellias and magnifying glasses, reduced to a bargaining chip in a negotiation between a desperate man and the woman he had trapped. Celeste did not argue. She did not stand up or scream or reach for the phone to call me. She simply folded, her shoulders curved inward, her head bowed, and she whispered a single word that the camera barely captured. "Okay." I closed the laptop. The screen went dark. The sounds of Clary's cafe rushed back in. The clatter of plates, a waitress laughing somewhere near the register, the hiss of a coffee machine, a world that had not stopped turning while mine had ground to a halt. I pulled a paper napkin from the dispenser and flattened it on the table with both palms. Then I took the pen from my shirt pocket, the same pen I used to write repair invoices for 40 years, and drew a single vertical line down the center. On the left, I wrote one word: protect. On the right, another: dismantle. A watchmaker knows that to fix a broken mechanism, sometimes you must first take it completely apart. Identify every compromised gear, remove every corroded spring, and then with steady hands and absolute precision, rebuild it from the ground up. I stood, left a $10 bill under the cold coffee cup, and walked out into the warm Savannah night. The air smelled of river mud and magnolia, a scent so familiar it should have felt like home, but home was no longer a place I could trust. It was a crime scene. And I was no longer just a retired watchmaker grieving his wife in a quiet workshop. I was the mechanism now. And every gear inside me was turning toward a single purpose. Wednesday morning arrived wearing the deceptive sweetness of a Savannah autumn. Magnolia blossoms still scented the air outside the kitchen window, and the low-angle October sun cast long amber streaks across the hardwood floors as though nothing in the world had changed overnight. But everything had changed. The man who poured coffee into Constance's favorite ceramic mug was not the same man who had put on his reading glasses in this kitchen 24 hours earlier. That man had been a retired watchmaker. This man was something else. This man was a mechanism with a purpose. I followed my routine with a precision that bordered on performance. Shower at 6:15, coffee at 6:30. 2 slices of toast, one with marmalade. I stepped onto the porch to scatter seed for the cardinals that nested in the live oak beside the garage. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture crafted to project the image of an old man settling comfortably into his quiet new life. If Mitchell's listening devices were still active, I wanted them to hear exactly that. The clink of a spoon, the creak of a screen door, the harmless puttering of a man who had no idea his life was being dismantled. At 9:42, my phone rang. Celeste. "Hi, Daddy." Her voice came through bright and carefully pitched, the tone of a daughter, performing the role of concerned child. "Just checking in. How are you feeling today?" I leaned against the kitchen counter and closed my eyes. 24 hours ago, I had listened to this same woman whisper okay, while her husband threatened to put our granddaughter in foster care. Now she was asking about my health with the cheerful ease of someone inquiring about the weather. "I am fine, sweetheart," I replied. My voice was steady, warm, calibrated to deliver exactly the amount of fatherly affection she expected. "Just been pottering around the garden. How is Rosalind?" "She is wonderful. Drawing butterflies all morning." Every question she asked, I realized, was a diagnostic probe. "How are you feeling?" translated to, "Have you noticed anything unusual with your accounts? Are you keeping busy?" Meant, "Are you still spending your days in the workshop instead of reviewing your financial documents?" She was not calling to check on my health. She was calling to check on their timeline. "Mitchell mentioned he wants to come by tomorrow afternoon to help you with that loose railing on the back porch," Celeste added. "That would be lovely," I said. "I will put the kettle on." The conversation lasted 4 more minutes. When I set the phone down on the counter, the warmth left my face like sunlight disappearing behind a cloud bank. The mask was for them. The action was for me. Have you ever pretended to be weaker than you are in order to survive? There is a term in horology called the hack function. It is the ability to stop the second hand of a watch on command, freezing the visible movement while the internal mechanism continues to operate in silence. That morning, I engaged my own hack function. The world would see a still face. Behind it, every gear was turning. I drove into Savannah proper and parked on Bull Street, 2 blocks from the main branch of the Live Oak Public Library. The building was a stately brick structure with tall arched windows and the quiet, reverential atmosphere of a place that still believed in the weight of printed words. I needed a neutral location, a computer terminal that could not be traced to my home network, and the anonymity of a public space where no one would question an older man researching legal topics. I sat down at a terminal in the back corner, shielded by tall shelves of reference volumes, and began searching. Elder abuse attorneys, power of attorney fraud, Chatham County specialists. I filtered through dozens of profiles and case histories with the same methodical focus I applied to diagnosing a faulty gear train, discarding anything that did not meet the precise specifications of my situation. One name surfaced repeatedly with a consistency that no search algorithm could manufacture. Helen Whitaker. 54 years old. Senior partner at Whitaker & Gaines, a firm on Drayton Street specializing in elder law, estate fraud, and financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. Her profile described a woman who had successfully prosecuted more than 40 cases of power of attorney abuse in the past decade, including 3 that had resulted in federal referrals. The reviews from former clients did not simply praise her competence. They described a woman who approached predatory fraud with a personal ferocity that suggested the work was more than professional for her. I wrote her number on the back of a library receipt and slipped it into my shirt pocket. Then I made a second call, this one from the parking lot, leaning against the warm hood of my truck as the midday sun cut through the canopy of oaks lining the street. Faye Calloway answered on the 3rd ring. She was 58, a retired forensic accountant living on Hilton Head Island, and she had been Constance's closest friend for nearly 30 years. The 2 of them had met in a gardening club in the early 90s and had maintained the kind of friendship that survives distance, illness, and the slow erosion of time. Faye had delivered the eulogy at Constance's funeral. She had held my hand in the front pew when I could not hold my own weight. I told her everything. The recordings, the forged power of attorney, the developer, the collection, Mitchell's malpractice debt, the threat against Rosalind. I laid it out the way I would describe a watch that had been deliberately sabotaged, each component identified, each failure point cataloged. When I finished, the line was silent for 5 full seconds. Then Faye spoke, and her voice carried the cold, precise edge of a woman who had spent her career following money through the darkest corridors of human behavior. "If there is a shell company involved, I will find it," she said. "Numbers do not lie, Frank. People do." She paused. "Constance would haunt me if I did not help." I scheduled a consultation with Helen Whitaker for Friday morning at 9:30. Faye promised a preliminary financial analysis by the weekend. 2 allies. 10 days. One chance to save everything before the deadline buried me. I pulled back onto the road toward Tybee Island. The truck windows down. The salt air filling the cab with the familiar scent of the marsh at low tide. For the first time since Beau's phone call, I felt the faintest stirring of something that resembled control, not confidence. Not yet. But the quiet satisfaction of a watchmaker who has identified every broken component and has begun, slowly and deliberately, to lay out the tools needed for the repair. Then I turned onto my street and the fragile scaffolding of that composure nearly collapsed. Celeste's silver sedan was parked in my driveway. Behind it sat Mitchell's black SUV. And standing on my front porch, deep in conversation with Mitchell, was a man in gray coveralls carrying a heavy equipment bag. They were not supposed to be here until tomorrow. A pest inspector who does not know the difference between a termite and a carpenter ant is not a pest inspector. And the instrument cases clipped to that man's belt did not contain insecticide. They contained surveying equipment. I climbed out of the truck and crossed the driveway with the measured gait of a man who had not spent the last 24 hours cataloging his own betrayal in a diner booth. The oyster shells crunched beneath my boots. The afternoon sun was angled low enough to cast long shadows from the live oaks across the front yard, draping the porch in a lattice of light and shade that made it difficult to read the expressions of the men standing there. Mitchell saw me first. He stepped forward with that handshake smile, the one that started at the mouth but never quite reached the eyes. "Frank," he said, extending his hand as though he owned the porch he was standing on, which, if his paperwork went through, he soon would. "I know we said tomorrow, but I ran into Dale here at the hardware store and figured we would get a jump on the inspection." The man in the gray coveralls nodded once. He was broad-shouldered, mid-40s, with the rough hands of someone who worked with tools, but the clean fingernails of someone who did not work with them often. His equipment bag hung from one shoulder, partially unzipped, and inside it I could see the chrome edge of a laser distance meter and what appeared to be a digital theodolite. Instruments for measuring angles and distances. Instruments for mapping the interior dimensions of a structure that was about to be sold to a man who intended to demolish it. "Dale Perkins," the man said, offering a hand that felt like a rehearsed gesture. "Pest control and structural assessment." I shook it. "Franklin Beaumont. Come on in. I will put the kettle on." A grandfather's hospitality is supposed to be the most natural thing in the world. But as I held the screen door open and ushered these men into my home, I felt as though I were inviting a surgeon into an operating theater to remove something vital while the patient smiled and offered him sweet tea. Mitchell led Dale through the house with the casual authority of a tour guide. They started in the basement, where Dale spent an unusually long time measuring the distance between the support columns. They moved through the first floor, where Dale pressed his laser meter against the baseboards of every room, while Mitchell stood in doorways making notes on his phone. They inspected the attic, the garage, and the crawl space beneath the back porch. At no point did Dale mention termites, moisture damage, or any of the concerns a legitimate pest inspector would prioritize. He was mapping the footprint. Every square foot, every load-bearing wall, every measurement Victor Hargrove would need to submit a demolition permit. I followed them at a distance, playing the role Mitchell had written for me. The slightly confused retiree. The trusting father-in-law, who deferred to younger men on matters of home maintenance. I asked Dale if he thought the house had termites. He said he would need to run some tests. I asked Mitchell if I should call an exterminator. He patted my shoulder and told me not to worry about it. The condescension in his touch made my jaw tighten so hard I could feel my molars grind. By 5:30, the inspection was over, and Celeste arrived with bags of takeout from a low-country restaurant on the island. She set the containers on the kitchen counter, and within minutes the house filled with the rich, heavy aroma of shrimp and grits, collard greens, and cornbread. It was the kind of meal Constance used to make on Friday evenings. The kind of smell that should have made this house feel alive again. Instead, it felt like a wake. We sat around the dining table, the same cherrywood table where Mitchell had video called Victor Hargrove 5 days earlier and calculated the liquidation value of my life. I watched him eat with the appetite of a man unburdened by conscience. He complimented the food. He asked about my garden. He told a story about a colleague's fishing trip to Tybee Creek. And between bites of shrimp, he steered the conversation toward what he called future-proofing my estate. "Have you given any more thought to consolidating your accounts, Frank?" he asked, dipping a piece of cornbread into the pot liquor. "With the market the way it is, it might make sense to simplify things. Fewer accounts, fewer headaches." I nodded slowly, chewing a piece of cornbread I could barely taste. "You are probably right, Mitchell. Numbers were never my strong suit. I just fix clocks. Have you ever sat across from someone who is actively stealing your life and had to serve them dinner while they do it? The shrimp tasted like nothing. The grits sat in my stomach like wet cement. Every laugh from Mitchell landed on my chest like a mallet, striking a bell that no one else could hear. Celeste was quiet for most of the meal. She kept her eyes on her plate, moving food around with her fork in the small, restless patterns of someone whose appetite had been replaced by anxiety. Then, halfway through a story Mitchell was telling about property values on the island, she said something that made the air in the room shift. "The downtown development is really changing things around here," she said casually. Then she stopped. Her fork paused mid-air. Her eyes flicked to Mitchell, who returned the glance with a look so brief and sharp it could have cut glass. Celeste lowered her fork and did not speak again for the rest of the meal. Downtown development. 2 words that confirmed she knew about Hargrove. 2 words that Mitchell's glare told her she should never have said aloud. They left at 7:15. I stood on the porch and watched the taillights of both vehicles disappear down the sandy lane. The marsh was turning violet in the last light, and the salt air carried the faint chatter of night insects beginning their shift. The house behind me was quiet. Too quiet. I walked into the workshop and sat down at my bench out of habit. The familiar scent of clock oil and magnolia wood wrapped around me, but it brought no comfort. Something felt wrong. Not a sound, not a smell, but a disruption in the order of the room. The way a watchmaker can sense when a single tool has been moved a 1/4 inch from its silhouette on the pegboard. I looked under the bench, then beneath the chair. My fingers found it on the 3rd pass. A small black disc, no larger than a shirt button, affixed to the underside of the workbench with a strip of adhesive. A microphone. Wireless. Battery-powered, transmitting every sound in my sanctuary to a receiver I could not see. Mitchell had not just inspected the house, he had wired it. I held the device in my palm, feeling its negligible weight. Something so small, yet capable of capturing every private word spoken in the one room I had believed was still mine. I thought of all the evenings I had sat here talking to Constance's photograph on the shelf. All the quiet confessions I had whispered to the empty room. Mitchell had heard them all. The violation was total. But so was my response. I did not crush the microphone. I did not rip it from the table and throw it into the marsh. Instead, I pressed it carefully back into place beneath the bench. Then I reached for the walnut-cased wall clock. Constance's clock. The one I had been repairing when Beau called. I wound it fully and set it on the shelf directly above the hidden microphone. The ticking filled the workshop. Steady, patient, relentless. If Mitchell wanted to listen, I would give him something to hear. The measured, unhurried heartbeat of a clock, counting down to his own destruction. Rosalind's laughter in the garden sounded exactly like her grandmother's. A bright, clear note that rose above the flower beds and drifted across the yard the way a bell chime carries over still water. I had not heard that sound, that particular frequency of joy, since before Constance became ill, and hearing it now, coming from the mouth of a 5-year-old girl kneeling in the dirt among the camellias, was enough to make the ache behind my ribs feel like something almost sacred. Thursday afternoon had arrived with a sky so blue it looked painted. the kind of autumn day the Georgia coast produces, as a final gift before the gray of November settles in. Celeste had brought Rosalind over after preschool, dropping her off with a quick wave from the driveway before driving away to run errands. For the next 3 hours, it was just the two of us. A grandfather and his granddaughter, alone in a garden planted by a woman neither of us could stop missing. The camellias had been Constance's greatest pride. She had planted the first row the year we moved into the house, digging the holes herself because she insisted that flowers needed to feel the hands of the person who loved them. Over the decades, the garden had grown into a sprawling tapestry of white, pink, and deep crimson blooms that lined the south side of the yard in thick, fragrant clusters. Constance had named each variety the way other people name children, with affection and private significance. The white ones near the fence were called winter brides. The deep red ones closest to the porch she called heartbeats. Rosalind moved between the rows on her hands and knees, examining each bloom with a magnifying glass she had found in Constance's dresser drawer the previous month. She treated the instrument with the seriousness of a scientist, holding it at exactly the distance I had shown her for proper focal length. Her small brow furrowed in concentration. "Grandpa? This one has more petals than the one yesterday," she announced, pointing to a pink camellia that had opened overnight. "I counted 17. 17, I repeated, kneeling beside her. The damp earth soaked through the knees of my work pants, and the cool soil pressed against my skin with a grounding weight that I needed more than I could explain. "That is a strong number. Your grandmother would have said that means it is showing off for company." Rosalind smiled at that. She had never met Constance, but the stories had built a presence so vivid that the girl sometimes spoke about her grandmother the way you speak about someone who has simply stepped into the other room. We worked our way through the beds together. I showed her how to check the soil moisture with her fingertip, how to identify the buds that would open within the week, and how to prune a spent bloom without damaging the branch collar. She listened with the focused attention of a child who senses she is being trusted with something important. Twice she corrected my grip on the pruning shears, mimicking the hand position I had demonstrated with a precision that startled me. Have you ever looked at a child and seen the unmistakable echo of someone you have lost? It is not a comfort exactly. It is more like a promise, written in a language you are still learning to read. We were crouched beside the heartbeat camellias near the porch when Rosalind leaned toward me and lowered her voice the way children do when they believe they are sharing a secret of enormous importance. "Grandpa," she whispered, "Daddy has been talking about a big move. He said we might live in a tall building downtown." The words landed softly, delivered in the innocent register of a child, repeating something she did not fully understand. But I understood. A tall building downtown. Mitchell was not just planning to sell my house and disappear with the money. He was planning to move his family into the very development that would replace it. The condominiums that Victor Hargrove would build on the ground where Constance's camellias grew. Mitchell intended to live on top of the ruins. I kept my face still. My hands continued their work in the soil, the dark earth cool and real beneath my fingernails. "That sounds like an adventure," I said carefully. "Do you want to live in a tall building?" Rosalind shook her head. "I want to stay here," she said. "The flowers are here, and your clocks are here." She paused, then looked up at me with the devastating directness only a child can produce. "Grandpa, when I grow up, can I fix clocks like you?" The question reached a depth inside me that no recording, no legal document, and no amount of financial treachery had been able to touch. It was the purest thing I had heard in days. A question asked without strategy or motive, carrying nothing but curiosity and the unshakable faith that the person she was asking would always be there to answer. "I will teach you everything, sweetheart," I said quietly, "starting with how to tell when something is broken." She smiled and returned to her magnifying glass, unaware that the man kneeling beside her was holding himself together with the same careful pressure he used to hold a fractured watch crystal in place while the adhesive set. At 4:30, Celeste returned. She stood on the patio and called out to Rosalind, her voice carrying that controlled brightness I had learned to hear through. Rosalind waved enthusiastically as she climbed into the back seat. Bye, Grandpa. See you Sunday. I lifted my hand in return. The silver sedan backed down the driveway and turned onto the lane. I watched it move through the dappled shade of the live oaks until the brake lights flared at the corner. That was when I saw it. A dull metallic glint beneath the rear bumper, partially concealed by the curve of the frame. I walked to the edge of the driveway and crouched low. A small magnetic device, no larger than a matchbox, was affixed to the underside of the chassis. A GPS tracker. Mitchell was not just manipulating paperwork and listening to my workshop. He was monitoring Celeste's movements, ensuring that his accomplice could not deviate from the schedule without his knowledge. I stood there for a long time, staring down the empty lane. The evening light had turned the marsh grass to bronze, and the air smelled of salt and cooling earth. The beauty of it was obscene. A postcard backdrop to the ugliest discovery of the day. Inside the house, the quiet had a different texture. I moved through the rooms with the deliberate, systematic attention of a man searching for something he hopes not to find. The kitchen was clean, the living room undisturbed, but in the bedroom, beneath the nightstand on my side of the bed, my fingers found a second device. Another microphone, identical to the one in the workshop, placed in the room where I slept, where I dreamed, where I sometimes spoke to Constance in the dark, because the silence was too heavy to carry alone. I did not remove it. I placed a small carriage clock on the nightstand directly above the hidden disc, wound it fully, and set it ticking. 2 bugs. 2 clocks. And one man who had decided that every tick Mitchell heard from this moment forward would be counting down to his end. I lay in the dark that night, listening to the twin rhythms of the workshop clock and the bedroom clock beating in near synchrony through the walls of the house. Tomorrow was Friday. Helen Whitaker. Faye Calloway. The gears were almost in position. A watchmaker never forces a gear into place. He aligns it with precision, tests the clearance, and lets the mechanism accept it naturally. On Friday morning, I pulled the heavy brass handle of the office door at 9:15. The cool October air, still clinging to my jacket, and stepped into the kind of quiet that belongs to places where serious work is done behind closed doors. The law offices of Whitaker and Gaines occupied the second floor of a restored federal-style building on Drayton Street. The staircase was narrow and old, the wooden treads worn smooth by decades of clients, climbing toward the hope of justice, or at least the consolation of due process. The reception area smelled of old paper and dark roast coffee, and the walls were lined with framed certificates and case citations that read like a catalog of battles fought and won on behalf of people who had been robbed by the ones they trusted most. Helen Whitaker met me at the door of her inner office. She was 54, sharp-featured, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of posture that suggested she had never in her life been unsure of where she stood. Her handshake was firm without being aggressive, and her eyes possessed the clinical depth of someone who had spent decades looking at documents and seeing the human wreckage hidden between the lines. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I placed the organized folder on the mahogany surface between us, the way I would place a disassembled movement on a workbench, every component labeled, every failure point identified. "I need a legal containment structure, Miss Whitaker," I said. "Something my son-in-law cannot bypass, circumvent, or appeal his way around." She looked at me for a long moment before opening the file. "Tell me everything, Mr. Beaumont," she replied. "Do not leave out the parts that hurt." I gave her the full mechanism: the forged power of attorney, the developer, the malpractice debt, the threats against Celeste, the insurance fraud used as leverage, the collection being appraised for private sale. I presented each piece with the systematic clarity of an engineer describing a structural failure, because that is exactly what it was. Helen reviewed the documents with an intensity that reminded me of the way I examine a damaged escapement. Her finger stopped on the notarization page of the power of attorney form. She reached for a second file on her desk, one she had clearly prepared in advance after our phone consultation, and compared the 2 documents side by side. "The notary on your forged document," she said, tracing the embossed seal with her fingernail, is a woman named Sandra Kelly. She was a paralegal in Mitchell Ward's office until 14 months ago. She left under what the Bar Association records describe as mutual separation, which in my experience means she was either fired or asked to leave before something became a problem. She looked up at me. This was not a random notary, Mr. Beaumont. This was an inside job. The confirmation settled over me like cold water. Mitchell had not stumbled into this scheme. He had assembled it with the same deliberate methodology he used to structure real estate transactions. Every player was chosen. Every document was engineered. My own daughter was simply the component he needed to gain access to the mechanism. Helen moved quickly after that. She produced the revocation forms, crisp and heavy in their legal stock, and I signed each page with a hand that did not waver. The notary's stamp hit the paper with a sharp metallic click that echoed in the quiet office, a sound that reminded me of the snap of a watch case closing after a completed repair. Definitive. Final. She informed me that by noon, every major financial institution and the county recorder's office would receive electronic notification that the Halbrook power of attorney was null and void. She also flagged my social security number for potential identity theft, explaining that in cases like these, the perpetrator often attempts to open secondary lines of credit as a fallback position. Have you ever felt the exact moment the tide turns? It does not happen with a roar. It happens in the silence between heartbeats, in the pause between one tick and the next, when the balance wheel shifts direction and the entire mechanism begins to move the other way. We were reviewing the final documents when my phone vibrated on the desk. Faye Calloway. I answered on speaker with Helen's permission, and Faye's voice filled the office with the controlled urgency of a woman who had found exactly what she was looking for and wished she had not. Frank, I traced the financial trail from the power of attorney filings, Faye began. Mitchell established a shell company 11 months ago. Palmetto Ventures, LLC, registered in Delaware. The sole listed officer is a registered agent service, but the operating agreement names Mitchell Ward as the managing member. Helen leaned forward, her pen poised above a legal pad. The company has one active bank account, Faye continued, and 6 weeks ago, $45,000 was transferred into that account from a source I had to dig through 3 layers of intermediary filings to identify. She paused. It came from Constance's trust, Frank. The irrevocable trust she established for Celeste's future. Mitchell found a way to reclassify a disbursement as an administrative fee and routed it through a payable account that redirected to Palmetto Ventures. The room went very still. Helen stopped writing. I stopped breathing. He stole from your dead wife, Frank, Faye said quietly. And there is more. He changed the primary beneficiary on your life insurance policy. It no longer names Celeste. It names Palmetto Ventures, LLC. I became aware of my hands. They were gripping the armrests of Helen's leather chair so tightly that the tendons stood out like bridge cables under maximum load. The mahogany desk in front of me blurred for a moment, and I felt something dangerous rising in my chest, a pressure that had nothing to do with blood flow, and everything to do with the realization that Mitchell Ward had not just targeted my assets or my property. He had reached into the resting place of the woman I loved and stolen from her legacy as though it were loose change left on a counter. For one full second, I nearly lost my composure. The watchmaker's discipline that had governed my hands for 4 decades buckled under the weight of that single revelation. Constance's trust. The money she had set aside with such care, sitting in her hospital bed with a pen that trembled as she signed the documents, telling me that this would ensure Celeste always had something to fall back on. Mitchell had converted that love into a wire transfer. Then I exhaled. Slowly. The way you release tension from a mainspring without letting it snap. A watchmaker's hands must never shake, I said to the quiet room. Not even when the mechanism he is disassembling once belonged to someone he loved. Helen and Faye were both silent for a moment. Then Helen picked up her pen and began writing again, her strokes quick and decisive. "We are going to dismantle this, Frank," she said. "Every single gear." Helen Whitaker once told me that the most dangerous moment in any legal battle is not the confrontation. It is the silence between the preparation and the strike. The silence where the enemy still believes he is winning. Friday afternoon. I left Helen's office on Drayton Street with a manila folder pressed flat against my chest. Inside were 3 certified documents: a revocation of the fraudulent power of attorney, a formal complaint filed with the Georgia Secretary of State regarding the forged notarization, and a signed authorization transferring primary control of all my financial accounts to a newly established custodial structure overseen by Helen's firm. The sun hit the cobblestones on Bull Street, and I stood there for 11 seconds, counting them the way I count the beats of a balance wheel. 11 seconds to remind myself that precision, not rage, would carry me through. By 2:15 that afternoon, I was seated inside the Savannah branch of Coastal Heritage Bank on Abercorn Street. The branch manager, a careful woman named Patricia Odom, had been notified by Helen's office an hour earlier. She led me to a private consultation room with frosted glass walls and a potted fern that smelled faintly of copper. I placed the folder on the table between us and explained, in the same measured tone I used when describing a complicated repair to a customer, exactly what I needed. I needed every liquid asset moved. The primary savings account held $412,000. The certificate of deposit, rolled over twice since Constance passed, held an additional $178,000. A smaller operating account, still labeled Beaumont and Sons Watch Repair, carried $130,000 from the final year of business. Combined, $720,000. My entire working life, reduced to 6 digits on a screen. Patricia typed steadily. She asked twice whether I understood that early withdrawal of the certificate would incur a penalty of $4,600. I told her I understood. She asked whether I wanted to designate a new beneficiary on the accounts. I said yes. I named the Rosalind Beaumont Educational Trust, an entity Helen had filed for incorporation that morning. Patricia printed the forms. I signed each one with the same fountain pen I had used to sign Constance's burial paperwork 3 years earlier. The ink was running low. I made a note to refill it. By 3:45, the transfer was complete. $720,000 now sat inside a restricted custodial account at a separate institution, First Atlantic Fiduciary in Charleston. Access required dual authorization. My signature and Helen Whitaker's countersignature. No single party could withdraw funds. No power of attorney, forged or otherwise, could override the structure. I drove home along Victory Drive with the windows down. The live oaks formed their usual cathedral overhead, and Spanish moss trailed against the roof of my truck like fingers trying to slow me down. I felt something I had not felt in days. Not peace. Certainty. It lasted until 6:14 that evening. I was in the kitchen heating leftover red beans and rice when my phone rang. The caller identification read, Coastal Heritage Bank. I answered. A young man, a different voice from Patricia, introduced himself as Kevin from the wire transfer department. He was calling because an authorized user on my accounts, a Mr. Mitchell R. Ward, had attempted to initiate a wire transfer of $65,000 to Palmetto Ventures LLC at 4:52 that afternoon. The system had flagged the request because the account had been closed and migrated. Kevin wanted to confirm whether the request was legitimate. I set the spoon down on the counter. I could hear the carriage clock ticking above the microphone Mitchell had planted in my workshop. 2 rooms away, that little device was still transmitting every sound in this house to whatever phone or laptop Mitchell monitored. I told Kevin the request was not legitimate. I asked him to document the attempt, including the timestamp, the routing number provided, and the name of the representative who processed Mitchell's call. Kevin assured me he would. I thanked him and hung up. $65,000. Mitchell had tried to pull $65,000 from an account that no longer existed under his reach. The speed of the attempt told me everything. He had not waited. He had not tested with a smaller amount. He had moved with the confidence of a man who believed his machinery was still functioning perfectly. And when the gears jammed, he would know. He would know that someone had changed the locks on the vault. I called Helen. She answered on the second ring. I relayed the details. She said she would subpoena the bank's call records and add the attempted transfer to the elder of use filing. Then she paused. "Frank," she said, "expect movement tonight. When a man like Mitchell discovers his access is gone, he does not sit quietly." She was right. At 9:27, the living room security camera I had repositioned to face the driveway recorded Celeste's white sedan pulling up to the curb. She did not come to the door. She sat in the car for 4 minutes, the interior light on, her phone glowing in her hands. Then she drove away. I checked the account notification on my phone. At 9:29, someone using Celeste's login credentials had attempted to access the Beaumont and Sons operating account through the bank's mobile application. The attempt was denied. Restricted. Locked. I sat in the dark parlor with the lights off and the curtains open. The Breguet reproduction on the mantel ticked its steady 72 beats per minute. Outside, the street was empty. No sedan, no headlights, only the oak branches swaying against a sky that smelled of rain and salt marsh. They knew now. Both of them. The vault was closed, the keys were gone, and the watchmaker was no longer sleeping. Tomorrow I would wait. I would let the silence do its work. Because in 40 years of repairing timepieces, I learned one truth that Mitchell Ward had never understood. A mechanism under tension does not need to be forced. It only needs time. And time, at last, was mine. Saturday morning arrived with a stillness that felt deliberate, as though the coast itself was holding its breath. I woke at 5:42, earlier than usual, and lay in bed listening to the carriage clock on the nightstand ticking above the hidden microphone. 72 beats per minute. I had wound it the night before, with the same care I applied to every mechanism in my life. Let Mitchell hear nothing but time passing. Let him wonder what it meant. By 7:15, I was at the kitchen table with black coffee and a legal pad. Helen had sent a text at 6. The formal revocation of Mitchell's authority over all Beaumont accounts had been filed electronically with Coastal Heritage Bank, First Atlantic Fiduciary, and the Chatham County Clerk of Court. Every document bearing Mitchell R. Ward's name as an authorized agent, financial representative, or co-I signatory had been nullified. The fraudulent power of attorney was now entered into the state record as a forged instrument under investigation. Helen's message ended with 5 words that carried the weight of a judge's gavel. He has no legal standing. I read those words 3 times. Then I wrote them on the legal pad in block letters and underlined them twice. At 8:20, Faye Calloway called from Hilton Head. She had been working through the night. Her voice was hoarse but precise. The voice of a woman accustomed to reading numbers the way I read gear trains. She had found something new. In addition to the Palmetto Ventures account that received the $45,000 stolen from Constance's trust, there was a third account. A personal brokerage held at a firm in Jacksonville, Florida. Opened 7 months ago under Mitchell's name alone. The account had received a series of deposits totaling $87,000 over the past 5 months. The deposits originated from 2 sources. $22,000 from the Palmetto Ventures operating account and $65,000 from a line of credit secured against the Beaumont property on Tybee Island. I set my coffee down. Mitchell had leveraged my house. He had taken a line of credit against the property I had owned for 31 years, the house where Constance and I raised Celeste, the house where Rosalind learned to count camellia petals. He had used forged documents to borrow $65,000 against the roof over my head. Faye continued. The brokerage account showed a pattern consistent with high-risk speculative trading. Losses over the past 3 months totaled $41,000. The remaining balance was approximately $46,000, but a margin call was pending. If the positions were not covered by the following Friday, the brokerage would liquidate, and Mitchell would owe an additional shortfall estimated at $12,000. I understood now. Mitchell was not merely greedy. He was drowning. The malpractice settlement demanded $500,000. The developer deal promised $3.2 million, but required the property sale to close by November 1st. The collection was worth up to $520,000, but had to be moved before October 25th. And beneath all of it, a speculative account was bleeding money, like a cracked mainspring leaking tension with every swing of the balance wheel. Every scheme was connected to every other scheme. Remove one gear, and the entire movement would cease. I thanked Faye. She said she would compile a complete forensic summary by Monday and send it to Helen. Then she added, quietly, "Frank, be careful this weekend. Desperate men do not calculate consequences." She was the second person to warn me in 12 hours. I noted that. The morning passed without incident. I repaired a customer's mantel clock in the workshop, a simple hairspring adjustment, while the microphone beneath the bench broadcast the sound of my tools and the ticking of 6 surrounding clocks. At 12:15, I ate a sandwich on the back porch and watched 2 pelicans skim the marsh. At 1:40, my phone rang. Mitchell. His voice was different. The smooth baritone I had heard on the security footage, the voice that negotiated developer commissions and quoted statutes to terrify my daughter, was gone. In its place was something compressed, tight, like a coil wound past its tolerance. "Frank," he said, "I do not know what kind of advice you have been getting, but you have made a very serious mistake. You have frozen accounts that I have legal authority to manage. You have disrupted financial arrangements that protect this entire family. I need you to call the bank on Monday morning and restore my access." I held the phone 6 inches from my ear. Through the kitchen window, I could see the live oak in the front yard. The one Constance had hung a tire swing from when Celeste was 9. "Mitchell," I said. "I spoke with my attorney. My accounts are exactly where they should be." The pause lasted 4 seconds. Then his voice dropped half an octave. "If you do not fix this, I will file for emergency conservatorship. I will have a judge declare you mentally unfit by Wednesday. And when that happens, I will not just manage your money, Frank. I will manage everything. The house, the collection, Celeste, Rosalind, all of it." The line went dead. I placed the phone on the porch railing and watched the pelicans circle back over the marsh. My hands were steady. A conservatorship filing. He would claim cognitive decline, argue that my recent financial decisions proved instability, and petition a Chatham County judge to grant him total legal control over my life and assets. It was the most dangerous threat he had made. And it was the most desperate. I called Helen. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Good. Let him file. A conservatorship petition requires a medical evaluation, and you will pass it without difficulty. But more importantly, the moment he files, he opens himself to discovery. I will see every document, every account, every transaction. He is handing us the keys to his own machinery." She then proposed the next step. A meeting at the Chatham County Title Office, scheduled for the following Thursday, to formally challenge the property transfer documents. Mitchell would be compelled to attend, and at that meeting we would present the first layer of evidence. I agreed. Thursday. 5 days away. 5 days of silence. 5 days of ticking clocks. And Mitchell would walk into a room, believing he was about to secure a signature. Instead, he would discover that every gear he had built was already turning against him. A watchmaker knows that the most dangerous moment for any spring is not when it is wound. It is the instant before it breaks. Sunday through Tuesday passed in a pattern I had designed myself. I woke early, wound every clock in the house, drank my coffee on the back porch, and waited. I did not call Celeste. I did not call Mitchell. I went to the workshop each morning and repaired the small jobs I had accepted before retirement. A Bulova with a stripped crown wheel, a Seth Thomas schoolhouse clock whose pendulum rod had warped in the Georgia humidity. Routine work. Meditative work. The kind of work that keeps a man's hands steady when his mind is circling something far more dangerous. Helen filed the formal challenge to the property transfer documents on Monday afternoon. The Chatham County Title Office confirmed the Thursday appointment at 10 in the morning. Mitchell would receive the notice by certified mail on Tuesday. Helen also filed a preemptive motion opposing any conservatorship petition, attaching my most recent medical records, a cognitive evaluation I had completed 6 months earlier for my insurance renewal, and a signed affidavit from Dr. Samuel Greer confirming that Frank Beaumont was, in his professional opinion, of sound mind and exceptional clarity for a man of 66 years. Helen said the motion would sit like a closed door waiting for Mitchell to walk into it. Faye delivered her forensic summary on Monday evening. 23 pages. Every transaction traced, every account mapped, every forged signature flagged. She had organized the findings into 3 categories: theft from Constance's irrevocable trust, fraudulent use of power of attorney, and unauthorized leveraging of real property. The total documented financial harm was $612,000. She noted, in a margin comment written in red ink, that the figure did not include the potential loss of the house itself, which was appraised at $1.8 million. If the developer sale had closed, the total exposure would have exceeded $2.4 million. I read the summary twice. Then I locked it in the fireproof safe beneath my workbench, beside Constance's wedding ring and the original deed to the house. Tuesday evening, the tension broke. At 6:31, Celeste called. Her voice was thin and rapid, the way it sounded when she was a teenager, and had broken something she did not want me to know about. She said Mitchell had been on the phone all day. He had called Anton Kraus, the antique dealer, and moved the collection pickup from October 25th to October 15th. Wednesday, tomorrow. Kraus would arrive with a climate-controlled transport van at 9 in the morning to begin cataloging and removing every watch from my workshop. I held the phone against my ear and looked across the room at the display cases. 14 timepieces behind glass. The Patek Philippe my father had given me when I graduated from the Savannah College of Art and Design. The Omega Seamaster that had belonged to my grandfather, the one Mitchell had lifted in that first video with such casual authority. The Breguet pocket watch, number 4712, built in 1890, worth between $200,000 and $250,000. And the others, each one carrying a memory that no appraiser could quantify. Constance had called them my congregation. She said I spoke to them the way some men speak to God, quietly and with an attention that bordered on reverence. Mitchell intended to have them packed into a van and driven away before the Thursday meeting, before Helen could present the evidence, before the title office could flag the forged documents. He was accelerating because he knew the window was closing. The malpractice escrow deadline was November 1st. The margin call on his Jacksonville account was due Friday. And now the title challenge threatened to freeze the property sale entirely. Every clock in Mitchell's scheme was running out of time, and he was doing what desperate men always do. He was winding the spring tighter instead of releasing it. I asked Celeste why she was telling me this. The silence on the line lasted 7 seconds. Then she said, in a voice so quiet I had to press the phone against my ear, "Because they are not his, Daddy. They were never his." I closed my eyes. In that sentence, I heard something I had not heard from my daughter in months. Resistance. Small and fragile and exhausted, but real, like the first tick of a watch that has been sitting still for years. I told her to do nothing. I told her to say nothing to Mitchell. I told her to go home, feed Rosalind dinner, read her a story, and lock the bedroom door. Celeste whispered okay and hung up. I sat in the workshop for a long time. The display cases glowed under the brass reading lamps. The Breguet caught the light and held it the way old gold always does, with patience. I thought about Mitchell arriving tomorrow morning with Anton Kraus and a transport van, expecting to find an old man too slow to stop him. I picked up the phone and called Helen. She answered on the first ring, as though she had been waiting. I told her about the accelerated pickup. She was silent for 3 seconds, then said, "He is panicking." Good. Panicked men make mistakes in front of witnesses. We revised the plan. The title office meeting on Thursday was still necessary, but we needed an earlier intervention. Helen proposed that I invite Mitchell to my workshop on Wednesday morning. Not to confront him. Her thigh blacked. Not to accuse him. Simply to discuss the collection. A calm, reasonable conversation between a father-in-law and a son-in-law. 9 o'clock. 1 hour before Anton Kraus was scheduled to arrive. I agreed. I would call Mitchell in the morning and extend the invitation myself. My voice would be steady. My tone would be warm. I would sound like a tired old man who had finally come to his senses and wanted to make things easier for the family. Mitchell would believe it because Mitchell had always believed that patience was the same as weakness. He had watched me for years, quiet and methodical, and concluded that I was simply slow. He had never understood that a watchmaker does not move slowly because he cannot move fast. He moves slowly because he knows that the most important adjustment is always the last one. Wednesday, 9 in the morning. Beaumont and Sons watch repair. Every gear was in position. The only thing left was to let the mechanism strike. Tuesday night. The house was silent except for the clocks. I counted 7 of them ticking from various rooms, each at its own tempo, each measuring the same hours in its own language. I had not slept. I did not intend to. At 11:15 I sat down at the kitchen table with the tablet Beau Thibodeau had given me the night everything changed. The screen still held the 5 original video files from the garage camera. I opened each one and reviewed them in order. Video 1. Mitchell and Celeste entering my workshop, photographing the collection. Video 2. The call to Victor Hargrove. The $3.2 million developer deal. Video 3. The forged power of attorney and the property transfer documents. Video 4. The call to Anton Kraus. The collection inventory and the plan to remove the watches before October 25th. Video 5. Mitchell threatening Celeste with the fake insurance claim and the mention of Rosalind in foster care by Christmas. I organized the files into a presentation folder on the tablet. Each video was labeled with a date, a timestamp, and a one-sentence description. Helen had instructed me to prepare 4 evidence packets. 1 for the title office on Thursday, 1 for Faye's forensic file, 1 for the police, and 1 for the confrontation tomorrow morning. The tablet would serve as the primary device for the workshop meeting. I connected it to the portable speaker I used to play Constance's jazz records and tested the volume. Mitchell's voice filled the kitchen at full clarity. Every word, every pause, every threat. I set the tablet on a charging cradle beside the coffee maker and turned to the second task. Helen had advised me to prepare a physical evidence binder as a backup. I spent the next 2 hours assembling it. The revoked power of attorney with the fraudulent notary stamp. Patricia Odom's confirmation of the account migration. The wire transfer attempt log showing Mitchell's $65,000 request. Phase 20 on the 3-page forensic summary. Printouts of the shell company registration for Palmetto Ventures. The line of credit taken against my house. The brokerage account statements from Jacksonville. And the signed affidavit from Dr. Samuel Greer, confirming my cognitive competence. I placed every document in a leather binder that had once belonged to Constance. She had used it for her garden club minutes. It smelled faintly of lavender and potting soil. I pressed my thumb against the leather and held it there for a moment, the way you hold a hand over a wound. By 1:30 in the morning, the evidence was prepared. I walked to the workshop. The display cases lined the east wall, 14 watches arranged on velvet cushions that Constance had sewn herself. I opened the first case and lifted the Patek Philippe. I held it to the light and watched the second hand complete 1 full revolution. Then I replaced it, and moved to the next case. The Omega Seamaster, the Longines, the Hamilton. Each one accounted for. Each one in its position. I reached the last case. The Breguet pocket watch, number 4712. I lifted it from its cushion and felt the familiar weight settle into my palm. 18-karat gold, hand-engraved case, a movement so fine that the original owner in 1890 had called it a mechanical poem. It was the most valuable piece in the collection, and it had been Constance's favorite. She used to hold it against her ear and say it sounded like a heart that refused to stop. I turned the watch over to check the case back, and I stopped. The case back was slightly loose, not damaged, loosened deliberately. I retrieved my smallest flathead screwdriver from the bench and carefully pried the cover open. Inside, pressed flat against the interior of the case back, was a folded piece of paper. The paper was thin, torn from a prescription notepad. I unfolded it under the magnifying lamp, Celeste's handwriting. Small, hurried, slanting to the right the way it always did when she was afraid. 6 words. Page 7 is not real. See. I read it 4 times. Then I walked back to the kitchen and opened the evidence binder. I turned to page 7 of the forged power of attorney document, the page that bore my signature authorizing Mitchell to act as my financial representative for all property transactions. The signature was convincing. Mitchell had studied my handwriting carefully, but now I looked at it with different eyes. Celeste was telling me that this page, the keystone of Mitchell's entire legal architecture, was fabricated. Not merely forged in the sense that I had not signed it, but fabricated in the sense that the original document had contained only 6 pages. Mitchell had inserted a 7th. He had manufactured an entire page of legal authorization that had never existed in any version of the original agreement. I sat down slowly. My daughter had hidden this message inside the one object she knew Mitchell would never open himself: the Breguet. The watch he intended to sell, but would never examine with a watchmaker's eye. She had placed it there knowing that only I would find it, because only I would ever open the case back of a pocket watch with the patience and precision the task required. Celeste had been building her own small mechanism inside the larger one. Silent. Hidden. Waiting. I folded the note and placed it inside a clear archival sleeve. Then I added it to the evidence binder as the final page. Tomorrow morning, when Mitchell sat across from me in the workshop and heard his own voice playing from the tablet, when Helen presented the forensic trail and the revoked documents, this note would be the last piece I revealed. The daughter he had threatened and controlled and silenced had left a message in the heart of a 19th century watch, and it would be the testimony that sealed every charge. I closed the binder. I checked the tablet one final time. I set my alarm for 7:30. Then I walked through the house and wound every clock. One by one, room by room. 14 mechanisms in the workshop, 7 in the hallways and parlor. The carriage clock above the microphone, the reproduction Breguet on the mantel, each one set to the same precise tempo. Tomorrow at 9 o'clock, every clock in Beaumont and Sons would strike at once. And Mitchell Ward would finally understand what it means to run out of time. Wednesday morning, October 15th. The air over Tybee Island carried the metallic smell of an incoming storm, and the live oaks along the road to Savannah stood perfectly still, as though every branch had decided to witness what was about to happen. I arrived at Beaumont and Sons Watch Repair on Broughton Street at 7:45. I had not opened the shop for business in 3 weeks, but the brass bell above the door still rang when I entered, and the display cases still caught the first light from the east-facing windows, the way they had for 31 years. I set the leather evidence binder on the counter beside the register. I placed the tablet on the repair bench, angled toward the chair where Mitchell would sit, and connected it to the portable speaker. I tested the volume once. Mitchell's voice emerged clean and sharp, negotiating the developer deal with Victor Hargrove as though the walls of my shop had always been listening. I brewed a pot of coffee in the back room, I set out 2 ceramic mugs. The blue ones Constance had bought at a street fair in 1993. Then I stood behind the counter and looked at the workshop. 14 watches in their cases along the east wall. The workbench, with its magnifying lamps and trays of springs and screws. The walnut shelf clock above the door. The one Constance had wound every morning for 26 years. And on every surface, on every shelf and mantel and bracket, the clocks I had collected and repaired over a lifetime. Each one wound. Each one synchronized to the second. At 8:52, Helen Whitaker arrived through the back entrance. She wore a navy suit and carried a slim briefcase. Behind her came Officer James Tate of the Savannah-Chatham Metropolitan Police Department, in plain clothes, a gray sport coat, and dark trousers. Helen had obtained a standby order from Judge Camille Broussard authorizing Officer Tate to be present as a witness, and, if necessary, to act on probable cause. He positioned himself in the back room, visible through the open doorway, but not immediately apparent from the front of the shop. Helen sat in the wooden chair to the left of the repair bench. She opened her briefcase and removed a single folder. She placed it face down on her lap. She looked at me and nodded once. At 9:03, the brass bell rang. Mitchell Ward stepped through the front door wearing a charcoal suit and a confidence that filled the room like cologne. He carried a leather portfolio under his right arm. His eyes swept the shop, registered Helen's presence, and paused for exactly 2 seconds. Then he smiled. "Frank," he said, "I did not realize you had company." "Mitchell," I said, "please sit down. Coffee is on the bench." He sat in the chair across from me, the one I had positioned directly in front of the tablet speaker. He did not touch the coffee. He placed his portfolio on the bench and opened it, revealing a set of documents I recognized immediately. The property transfer papers, the financial authorization, and a new form I had not seen before, a voluntary asset management agreement pre-dated to August. "I brought these so we can clear up the confusion," Mitchell said. "Your bank informed me that there has been some kind of administrative error with the accounts. I assumed you were concerned, so I prepared updated paperwork that simplifies everything. One signature, Frank. That is all this requires." I looked at the documents. Then I looked at Mitchell. His eyes were steady, but the muscles along his jaw were tight, the way metal tightens before it fractures. "Before we discuss paperwork," I said, "I would like you to listen to something." I pressed play on the tablet. The first recording filled the workshop. Mitchell's voice, captured by Bo's garage camera, speaking to Victor Hargrove on the video call. The $3.2 million sale. The $400,000 facilitation fee. The November 1st deadline. The demolition scheduled for January. Mitchell's own words. "Sentimental value means nothing when the numbers are this good." Mitchell's smile disappeared. It did not fade. It vanished, the way a light vanishes when the circuit breaks. "Turn that off," he said. I did not turn it off. The recording ended, and I pressed play on the second file. Mitchell's voice again. The call to Anton Kraus. The collection inventory. The Patek Philippe at 90 to 120,000. The Breguet at 200 to 250,000. The total valuation of $400 to $520,000. Mitchell's instruction to have everything packed and removed before Frank notices. Mitchell stood halfway from his chair. "Where did you get that?" Helen spoke for the first time. "Sit down, Mr. Ward." He looked at her. She held his gaze without blinking. He sat. The third recording played. Faye Calloway's voice this time, reading from her forensic summary during a recorded deposition Helen had arranged on Monday. The Palmetto Ventures Shell Company. The 6 transfers totaling $45,000 stolen from Constance Beaumont's irrevocable trust. The reclassified administrative fees. The Delaware registration listing Mitchell R. Ward as sole managing member. Mitchell's face had gone the color of old plaster. His hands gripped the edge of the repair bench. I could see the tendons standing out beneath the skin, white ridges running from knuckle to wrist. The fourth recording. The final one. Mitchell's voice on the garage camera, speaking to Celeste. The malpractice settlement. The $500,000 escrow deadline. The fake insurance claim. And then the threat. The exact words, played at full volume in the workshop where my grandfather had first taught me to hold a screwdriver. You want to explain to Rosalind why Mommy is wearing orange. The recording ended. The workshop fell silent. Not silent. Never truly silent in a watchmaker's shop. Every clock on every wall and shelf continued its rhythm. 14 watches in their cases. The walnut shelf clock above the door. The carriage clocks on the mantel. The bracket clocks on the shelves. Dozens of mechanisms, all synchronized, all ticking at 72 beats per minute, filling the room with a sound like a pulse that belonged to the building itself. Mitchell looked at the tablet. He looked at Helen. He looked at me. And every clock in the room began to strike 10. The clock struck 10. Every mechanism in the workshop released its hammer at the same instant. And the sound that filled Beaumont and Sons was not a chime. It was a verdict. Deep brass tones from the walnut shelf clock above the door. Bright silver rings from the carriage clocks on the mantel. The low, resonant pulse of the grandfather clock in the corner. The one Constance had named Old Parliament because she said it sounded like a judge clearing his throat before sentencing. The sound layered and multiplied until the walls themselves seemed to vibrate, and I stood behind the counter with my hands flat on the glass and let the room speak for me. Mitchell did not move during the striking. He sat in the chair with his hands still gripping the edge of the repair bench, his knuckles bloodless, his jaw locked. The portfolio of forged documents lay open in front of him, like a confession he had written himself. The final echo of the 10th strike faded into the dust motes floating through the morning light, and the shop returned to the steady 72 beats per minute of its resting pulse. Helen Whitaker stood. She lifted the folder from her lap, turned it face up, and placed it on the bench directly over Mitchell's portfolio. The folder contained a single-page summary of the charges her office intended to present to the Chatham County District Attorney, elder financial abuse under Georgia Code Section 16-5-102, forgery in the first degree, identity fraud, fraudulent transfer of real property, theft by conversion from an irrevocable trust, and coercion of a family member to facilitate financial crimes. 6 charges, each one carrying a minimum sentence. Each one documented, recorded, and verified. Mr. Ward, Helen said, you are not under arrest at this moment. However, Officer Tate is present as an authorized witness under a standby order issued by Judge Camille Broussard. If you attempt to leave this building, destroy any evidence, or contact any party involved in these transactions, Officer Tate will detain you on probable cause. I strongly advise you to remain seated. Mitchell's eyes moved to the backroom doorway. Officer Tate stepped forward into full view, his badge now visible on his belt, his posture unhurried but absolute. He did not speak. He did not need to. Mitchell turned back to me. Something shifted behind his face. The confidence was gone. The calculated warmth was gone. What remained was raw and cornered, the expression of a man who had spent months building a machine he believed was perfect and had just watched every gear shatter on a watchmaker's bench. Frank, he said. His voice cracked on the single syllable. This is a misunderstanding. I was protecting the family's interests. Everything I did was for Celeste and Rosalind. I reached beneath the counter and removed the clear archival sleeve containing Celeste's note. The small piece of prescription paper, torn and folded, with 6 words in my daughter's handwriting. I placed it on the bench beside the tablet. Page 7 is not real. I read aloud. Your wife hid this inside the Breguet pocket watch. The one you intended to sell for $200,000. She placed it there because she knew you would never open the case back yourself. She knew that only a watchmaker would find it. Mitchell stared at the note. His lips parted but no sound came. She also called me last night, I continued. She told me you moved the collection pickup to today. She told me because she wanted me to stop you. Your wife has been afraid of you for months, Mitchell. She signed what you told her to sign. She said what you told her to say. But she never stopped being my daughter. The room held its breath the way rooms do when the truth finally arrives, and there is no mechanism left to delay it. Mitchell lunged. He did not lunge toward me. He lunged toward the tablet. His hand shot across the bench and grabbed for the device, knocking the portable speaker to the floor. The speaker hit the hardwood, and the battery cover cracked open. But the tablet was already in my hand. I had lifted it the instant I saw his shoulder drop. The same reflex I used when a customer's child reached for a display case. 40 years of protecting delicate things. Officer Tate was across the room in 3 strides. He caught Mitchell's right arm as it swept back from the bench and guided him firmly, but without violence, to a standing position. Mitchell twisted once. A reflexive spasm, then went still. Tate spoke for the first time. "Sir, I am detaining you on probable cause pending formal charges. Please place your hands behind your back." Mitchell complied. His breathing was shallow and rapid, like a mainspring that had been overwound past its limit and was now vibrating without purpose. Tate secured the handcuffs and read the Miranda advisory in a steady monotone that sounded, in that room full of ticking clocks, like just another mechanism doing its job. Helen collected the portfolio of forged documents from the bench and sealed them in an evidence bag she had brought in her briefcase. She placed the tablet, the archival sleeve with Celeste's note, and the physical evidence binder into a second bag. Every piece accounted for, every gear preserved. I walked to the front door and opened it. The morning air came in carrying the smell of rain and river mud, and the distant sound of a church bell striking from one of the squares. Broughton Street was waking up. A woman walked past with a stroller. A delivery truck idled at the curb. The world continued its ordinary rhythm, indifferent to the fact that inside this shop, a man's machinery had just been dismantled down to its last screw. Officer Tate led Mitchell through the door. Mitchell did not look at me as he passed. His eyes were fixed on the sidewalk, and his jaw was working silently, grinding words he would never have the chance to use as weapons again. I stood in the doorway and watched the patrol car pull away from the curb. Then, I turned back to the workshop. The clocks were still ticking. The display cases still held their 14 watches. The Breguet pocket watch sat on the bench where I had placed it that morning, its case back open. The space where Celeste's note had been now empty and waiting, like a chamber in a heart that had finally been heard. I picked up the blue coffee mug Mitchell had never touched. I poured the cold coffee into the sink, and I began to clean my shop. The clocks struck 10. Every mechanism in the workshop released its hammer at the same instant, and the sound that filled Beaumont and Sons was not a chime. It was a verdict. Deep brass tones from the walnut shelf clock above the door. Bright silver rings from the carriage clocks on the mantel. The low, resonant pulse of the grandfather clock in the corner, the one Constance had named Old Parliament because she said it sounded like a judge clearing his throat before sentencing. The sound layered and multiplied until the walls themselves seemed to vibrate. And I stood behind the counter with my hands flat on the glass and let the room speak for me. Mitchell did not move during the striking. He sat in the chair with his hands still gripping the edge of the repair bench, his knuckles bloodless, his jaw locked. The portfolio of forged documents lay open in front of him, like a confession he had written himself. The final echo of the 10th strike faded into the dust motes floating through the morning light, and the shop returned to the steady 72 beats per minute of its resting pulse. Helen Whitaker stood. She lifted the folder from her lap, turned it face up, and placed it on the bench, directly over Mitchell's portfolio. The folder contained a single-page summary of the charges her office intended to present to the Chatham County District Attorney. Elder financial abuse under Georgia Code Section 16-5-102, forgery in the first degree, identity fraud, fraudulent transfer of real property, theft by conversion from an irrevocable trust, and coercion of a family member to facilitate financial crimes. 6 charges, each one carrying a minimum sentence. each one documented, recorded, and verified. "Mr. Ward," Helen said, "you are not under arrest at this moment. However, Officer Tate is present as an authorized witness under a standby order issued by Judge Camille Broussard. If you attempt to leave this building, destroy any evidence, or contact any party involved in these transactions, Officer Tate will detain you on probable cause. I strongly advise you to remain seated." Mitchell's eyes moved to the backroom doorway. Officer Tate stepped forward into full view, his badge now visible on his belt, his posture unhurried, but absolute. He did not speak. He did not need to. Mitchell turned back to me. Something shifted behind his face. The confidence was gone. The calculated warmth was gone. What remained was raw and cornered. The expression of a man who had spent months building a machine he believed was perfect and had just watched every gear shatter on a watchmaker's bench. "Frank," he said. His voice cracked on the single syllable. "This is a misunderstanding. I was protecting the family's interests. Everything I did was for Celeste and Rosalind." I reached beneath the counter and removed the clear archival sleeve containing Celeste's note. The small piece of prescription paper, torn and folded, with 6 words in my daughter's handwriting. I placed it on the bench beside the tablet. "Page 7 is not real," I read aloud. "Your wife hid this inside the Breguet pocket watch, the one you intended to sell for $200,000. She placed it there because she knew you would never open the case back yourself. She knew that only a watchmaker would find it." Mitchell stared at the note. His lips parted, but no sound came. "She also called me last night," I continued. "She told me you moved the collection pickup to today. She told me because she wanted me to stop you. Your wife has been afraid of you for months, Mitchell. She signed what you told her to sign. She said what you told her to say. But she never stopped being my daughter." The room held its breath the way rooms do when the truth finally arrives, and there is no mechanism left to delay it. Mitchell lunged. He did not lunge toward me. He lunged toward the tablet. His hand shot across the bench and grabbed for the device, knocking the portable speaker to the floor. The speaker hit the hardwood, and the battery cover cracked open. But the tablet was already in my hand. I had lifted it the instant I saw his shoulder drop, the same reflex I used when a customer's child reached for a display case. 40 years of protecting delicate things. Officer Tate was across the room in 3 strides. He caught Mitchell's right arm as it swept back from the bench and guided him firmly, but without violence, to a standing position. Mitchell twisted once, a reflexive spasm, then went still. Tate spoke for the first time. "Sir, I am detaining you on probable cause pending formal charges. Please place your hands behind your back." Mitchell complied. His breathing was shallow and rapid, like a mainspring that had been overwound past its limit, and was now vibrating without purpose. Tate secured the handcuffs and read the Miranda advisory in a steady monotone that sounded, in that room full of ticking clocks, like just another mechanism doing its job. Helen collected the portfolio of forged documents from the bench and sealed them in an evidence bag she had brought in her briefcase. She placed the tablet, the archival sleeve with Celeste's note, and the physical evidence binder into a second bag. Every piece accounted for, every gear preserved. I walked to the front door and opened it. The morning air came in carrying the smell of rain and river mud and the distant sound of a church bell striking from one of the squares. Broughton Street was waking up. A woman walked past with a stroller. A delivery truck idled at the curb. The world continued its ordinary rhythm, indifferent to the fact that inside this shop, a man's machinery had just been dismantled down to its last screw. Officer Tate led Mitchell through the door. Mitchell did not look at me as he passed. His eyes were fixed on the sidewalk, and his jaw was working silently, grinding words he would never have the chance to use as weapons again. I stood in the doorway and watched the patrol car pull away from the curb. Then I turned back to the workshop. The clocks were still ticking. The display cases still held their 14 watches. The Breguet pocket watch sat on the bench where I had placed it that morning, its case back open. The space where Celeste's note had been now empty and waiting, like a chamber in a heart that had finally been heard. I picked up the blue coffee mug Mitchell had never touched. I poured the cold coffee into the sink, and I began to clean my shop. The weeks that followed Mitchell's arrest moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a clock being reassembled. Each day brought a new piece into alignment, and I learned to trust the process the way I had always trusted the process. One gear at a time, one jewel at a time, one careful adjustment, until the mechanism ran true. Celeste cooperated fully. She met with Helen Whitaker the day after the arrest and provided a sworn statement detailing every document Mitchell had forced her to sign, every threat he had made regarding Rosalind, and every transaction she had witnessed but been too frightened to report. Her testimony confirmed what Faye Calloway's forensic analysis had already proven. But it added something the numbers could not. A human voice describing what it felt like to watch your husband dismantle your father's life while holding your daughter's safety over your head like a hammer. The Chatham County District Attorney filed formal charges against Mitchell Raymond Ward on October 22nd. 6 counts, exactly as Helen had outlined in the workshop. Elder financial abuse, forgery in the first degree, identity fraud, fraudulent transfer of real property, theft by conversion from an irrevocable trust, coercion of a family member to facilitate financial crimes. Mitchell's attorney, a man from Jacksonville I had never met, entered a plea of not guilty at the arraignment. Bail was set at $350,000. Mitchell posted it using funds from the brokerage account Faye had identified, which triggered an additional investigation by the Florida Division of Securities. In November, Judge Camille Broussard issued a temporary restraining order prohibiting Mitchell from contacting Frank Beaumont, Celeste Beaumont Ward, or Rosalind Ward. The order also froze all assets connected to Palmetto Ventures LLC pending the outcome of the criminal trial. Victor Hargrove, the developer, withdrew from the property deal within 72 hours of Mitchell's arrest. His attorneys cited unresolved title issues. Helen told me privately that Hargrove was facing his own inquiry from the Georgia Real Estate Commission regarding undisclosed facilitation payments on 3 prior transactions. The $3.2 million sale of my house died on the vine, and the deed remained exactly where it had been for 31 years. In my name, recorded at the Chatham County Clerk of Court. Faye completed her final forensic report in late October. Total documented financial harm, $612,000. Total prevented loss, including the house and the collection, approximately $2.7 million. She mailed me the report in a brown envelope with a handwritten note on the front. Constance would be proud. So am I. The criminal trial began in January. It lasted 9 days. Celeste testified on the 3rd day. I sat in the gallery and watched my daughter walk to the witness stand, wearing a gray dress I had never seen before, and shoes that were too large for her feet, as though she had borrowed them that morning and had not had time to find the right size. She spoke for 2 hours. She did not cry. She answered every question in a voice that started small and grew steadier with each answer, like a balance wheel finding its rhythm after years of sitting motionless in a drawer. Mitchell was convicted on all 6 counts in February. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in the Georgia State Correctional System, with eligibility for parole after 5. He was also ordered to pay full restitution of $612,000. Though Helen told me the actual recovery would depend on what remained after the brokerage losses and legal fees. I did not attend the sentencing. I had already heard everything I needed to hear in my workshop on the morning the clock struck 10. Celeste filed for divorce in March. It was finalized in April. She resumed using her maiden name, Celeste Beaumont. She and Rosalind moved into the guest cottage behind the main house on Tybee Island, the one Constance and I had built in 2004 as a studio for her watercolors. I repainted the walls and replaced the kitchen faucet. Rosalind chose the color for her bedroom, pale yellow, like the camellias Constance had called winter brides. In late March, I reopened Beaumont and Sons Watch Repair. Not full-time. 3 days a week. Tuesday through Thursday. 9 to 4. Beau Thibodeau helped me repaint the front door and install a new brass bell, though the old one had worked perfectly well. He said a new beginning deserved a new sound. I did not argue. On the first morning I unlocked the shop, Rosalind was with me. She stood on a step stool behind the counter and watched me open the display cases. 14 watches, each in its place. The Patek Philippe, the Omega Seamaster, the Longines, the Hamilton, and the Breguet pocket watch, number 4712. Its case back, now closed and sealed. The chamber where Celeste's note had been hidden now holding only air and the faint memory of 6 words that had changed everything. Rosalind pointed to the Breguet. "Can I listen to it, Grandpa?" I lifted the watch from its cushion and held it to her ear. She closed her eyes and smiled. "It sounds like a tiny heart," she said. "It is," I said. "It belonged to your grandmother. And one day, when you are ready, I will teach you how to keep it beating." I set the watch back on its velvet cushion. The morning light came through the east window and fell across the bench where I had spent 31 years learning that the most important quality a craftsman can possess is not skill. It is patience. The willingness to sit with broken things and believe, against all evidence, that they can be made whole again. Constance once told me that a clock is just a promise that the next second will come, and the one after that, and the one after that. She said the people who build clocks are not engineers, they are optimists. I wound the walnut shelf clock above the door. I turned the sign in the window from closed to open, and I waited for the first customer of the day, listening to the sound of every clock in the room keeping time together, steady and synchronized, the way they were always meant to be. If you have been listening to this story, and you know someone who has ever been taken advantage of by a person they trusted, share this with them. Not because it will fix what happened, but because sometimes knowing that someone else fought back is enough to help a person find the courage to do the same. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe to this channel so you will be here when the next one begins. Because there is always another story, and there is always someone who needs to hear it.